Breaking news, President Trump goes off on an extraordinary rant, at times taking on a messianic tone. After retweeting a notorious conspiracy theorist who suggested that he's loved like the second coming of God, the president declared to reporters that he's, quote, the chosen one to take on China over its trade practices. He once again attacked Jewish Democrats and repeatedly slammed the media, along with former President Obama. And using one of his choice insults for women, the president called Denmark's prime minister nasty for calling his interest in buying Greenland absurd. The president zigzagged on guns and background checks. He flip-flopped on the economy, saying he's not looking at a tax cut a day after suggesting he was. I'll be speaking with Congressman Mike Quigley, who is on the Intelligence Committee, and our correspondents and analysts have full coverage of the day's top stories. Let's begin with CNN Chief White House correspondent Jim Acosta. And Jim, the president seems to have anointed himself today.
That's certainly right, Brianna. The president sounded as though he had something of a God complex at times today, declaring himself the chosen one and accepting praise from an ally who dubbed Mr. Trump on Twitter as the second coming. But the president wasn't so charitable when he doubled down on how he feels Jewish Americans should vote against Democrats and describing the prime minister of Denmark as nasty for rejecting his advances on Greenland. There were times when he sounded messianic and sometimes just a mess. Taking his questionable rhetoric to new heights, President Trump talked about himself in biblical terms, at one point looking to the sky as he praised his handling of the economy as godlike.
I am the chosen one. Somebody had to do it. So I'm taking on China. I'm taking on China on trade. And you know what? We're winning.
The president stirred up more outrage, repeating his belief that Jewish Americans face a loyalty test in the upcoming election.
If you vote for a Democrat, you're very disloyal to Israel and to the Jewish people.
After some Jewish American groups slammed that remark as anti-Semitic, the president accepted the support of conservative commentator and conspiracy theorist Wayne Allen Root, who portrayed Mr. Trump in messianic terms, tweeting, "Thank you to Wayne Allen Root for the very nice words. President Trump is the greatest president for Jews and for Israel in the history of the world. And the Jewish people in Israel love him like he's the king of Israel. They love him like he is the second coming of God."
I have been responsible for a lot of great things for Israel. One of them was moving the embassy to Jerusalem, making Jerusalem the capital of Israel.
Mr. Trump shifted once again on the topic of tightening background checks after sources told CNN he all but assured NRA President Wayne LaPierre he was siding with the powerful gun lobby.
Oh, I have an appetite for background checks. We're going to be doing background checks. We're working with Democrats. We're working with Republicans. We already have very strong background checks, but we're going to be filling in some of the loopholes. We just talked about concepts. Wayne agrees things have to be done also.
The president got testy in defending his decision to scrap his upcoming trip to Denmark after that country's prime minister rejected Mr. Trump's expansionist designs on Greenland as absurd.
I thought that the prime minister's statement that it was absurd, it was an absurd idea, was nasty. I thought it was an inappropriate statement. All she had to do is say, no, we wouldn't be interested. Don't say what an absurd idea that is, because she's not talking to me. Excuse me. She's not talking to me. She's talking to the United States of America. You don't talk to the United States that way, at least under me.
On a range of questions, Mr. Trump repeatedly pointed his finger at former President Barack Obama.
Under President Obama, Russia outsmarted President Obama. President Obama did that.
Consider his defense of the Trump administration's new plan to detain migrant families for longer periods at the border.
I am the one that kept the families together. Okay? You remember that, right? Just remember I said it. And now it gets even better. President Obama and others brought the families apart. But I'm the one that kept the families together.
But that's not true. It was Mr. Trump who launched a policy of family separations. Still, the president insists he cares about migrant children.
But let me just tell you, very much I have the children on my mind. It bothers me very greatly.
Now, after all of that, the president joked to a group of American veterans today that he would like to give himself the Medal of Honor. Mr. Trump, who is not a military veteran and avoided service during the Vietnam War, says he was told by his staff that awarding himself the Medal of Honor would not be a good idea. He can't be chosen for that one. Brianna?
Jim Acosta at the White House, thank you. And President Trump today lashed out at that U.S. ally Denmark, but he did have nice words for Russia. So let's turn to CNN national security reporter Kylie Atwood for the latest on this. What happened?
He reiterated what he said time and time again, which is that President Trump would like to see President Putin back at the table with the G7. Now, I'm told by a senior administration official that yesterday, when President Macron of France and President Trump spoke over the phone, they agreed that Putin should be invited to the 2020 G7 meetings next year. Now, I'm told that President Macron threw out the idea, trying to basically put the onus on Trump to be the one to own the idea, and he's doing just that. But imagine, Brianna, how controversial and dramatic it would be if President Putin came here to the U.S. for a G7 meeting just months ahead of the 2020 presidential election here. Obviously, that would be controversial because we know that every intelligence agency says that's Russia who meddled in the 2016 elections, and President Trump has never gone that far and agreed with them. So it would be pretty dramatic if he were here in the United States. The other thing to consider is that Trump is headed to the G7 just this weekend, and we know that he's going to be discussing this topic with other members of the G7 who have agreed that Russia shouldn't be allowed back in. But Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, a new leader that President Trump is hoping he's going to see eye to eye with, just said today that he doesn't even think that there's a case yet to be made for Russia to be allowed back in. So that could create some tension between these two leaders that are hoping to start off on a good foot.
He's dissing Denmark, blaming the Danish prime minister for saying that his possible purchase or sort of inquiry, curiosity about purchasing Greenland was absurd. But it's important to point out that Denmark is an important ally of the U.S.
Exactly right. So President Trump canceled this trip via tweet to Denmark because the prime minister, as you said, called it absurd that the president wanted to buy Greenland. But the important thing here is that both Danish officials and folks who live there are feeling a little bit like they've been treated unfairly here because they have stood next to the U.S. for years, especially when it comes to national security. The U.S. has been allowed to use strategic bases in Greenland since the Cold War that allows the U.S. to listen in on Russia and other things across the Arctic. And the Danish troops have fought alongside U.S. soldiers in both Iraq and Afghanistan. 43 Danish troops died in Afghanistan fighting alongside U.S. soldiers. So there's clearly some hard feelings here, and we're going to have to see how the relationship moves forward at this point.
Understandably so. Kylie Atwood, thank you so much for that report. And joining me now is Democratic Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois. He is a member of the Intelligence Committee. Sir, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Let's begin with the president going all in today on his claim that American Jews who vote for Democrats are, in his words, very disloyal to Israel and the Jewish people. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, this is a very tired, old anti-Semitic trope that I hope wouldn't be used again, much less by the President of the United States. When I first got to Congress 10 years ago, it was drilled into our heads that Israel can't be a partisan issue. Eric Cantor on the Republican side, Steny Hoyer on the Democratic side said it is not in the U.S. interest for that to happen. It is clearly not in Israel's interest and very short-sighted of Mr. Netanyahu to think that this should become a partisan issue. And for the president to move in the opposite direction is really dangerous at this time.
Well, definitely that you're pointing out here, this is cross-partisan lines. Are you concerned the fact that he is politicizing Israel, that may be doing long-term damage?
I think the damage has been done for the last couple of years with the Trump White House. I'd like to think that cooler heads will prevail sometime when the president is no longer in office, but there's absolutely too much at stake. I've been to Israel numerous times and recognize the critical nature of our alliance as an extraordinarily important democracy, the only real democracy in the Middle East. That relationship matters, but the votes on Israel are extraordinarily important, and they've always been bipartisan. For him to suggest that Democrats don't support Israel is a mistake. In fact, most Jews in the United States are registered Democrats.
I want to talk about the president's canceled trip to Denmark. He made this move after the Danish prime minister called his proposal to buy Greenland absurd. Denmark has been a key U.S. ally. They provide intelligence. They've sent troops in the fights in Iraq and Afghanistan. Does his canceling this trip, where they would have discussed security issues, hurt U.S. national security?
You know, I think it hurts our security. I think it hurts our standing in the world as a whole. I just don't know what the president is thinking. This isn't a land deal in Manhattan where they're trying to build a high-rise and you can pressure somebody for the purchase. This is a self-governing people of Greenland under the larger government of Denmark. So it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, what's next? Next week we talk about purchasing the Falklands, and if that doesn't work, we get angry with their government. It's bizarre. I don't know how else to explain it. And for the Prime Minister, Danish Prime Minister, to call it absurd is absolutely correct.